In this cultural moment, we've been experiencing the growing pains of trying to live into the kind of diverse and inclusive communities that are representative of the kingdom of God. Given that people with disabilities make up 18 to 20% of the population in the U.S. and affect every imaginable people group, our churches need to know how to welcome, empower, and be led by disabled people. Tom Shakespeare, a British man with a disability, a great scholar and a disability advocate, wrote a book called Disability Rights and Wrongs. Now, Tom Shakespeare has restricted growth or a kind of dwarfism or dysplasia. And what he did in his book, Disability Rights and Wrongs, is he critiqued the British strong social model of disabilities. In the British strong social model of disability, the idea is that the disability has nothing to do with one's impairment. It has everything to do with the way that society is developed. Well, he challenged this model because he, as someone with restricted growth, experiences back problems and gastrointestinal issues. He's a wheelchair user, and because of this, he does face some complications. But the critique was so strong against him critiquing this model that a whole journal came out challenging his approach. And one author even concluded that Tom Shakespeare is no longer disabled, but is in fact disabling. Who gets to decide whether or not Tom Shakespeare is disabled? That brings us into this question of what in the world is disability? We think we know it when we see it, but so much of disability is unseen. Think about it. Neurological problems, neuropathy, pain that people feel that makes it so they can't participate in society the way that they want to, mental health challenges, people on the autism spectrum who can pass as not having a disability, but it really does make life more challenging. Whatever else it is, disability is a social construct. That doesn't mean that it's not real. It just means that each society determines what is disabling. And in fact, it's a range or a spectrum. Right now, you wouldn't consider me disabled, but right now, you wouldn't want me to drive a car anywhere near you. I can't see. But is there any stigma to me wearing these glasses? There's no social consequences to wearing glasses. People don't treat me differently. In fact, where I am in the academy, it helps. It makes me fit in even better. I look like more of a potential nerd. That's good in my situation. So disability is a spectrum. We talk about the autism spectrum. People for where their autism makes it challenging for them to do the most simple tasks, and other where their autism seems to give them special abilities to understand and see connections other people can't. So it's an experiential reality that has social, mental, psychological, physical consequences. Now, models help us to understand things. They don't completely describe them, but they help us to understand. And one of those models is the medical model of disability. And this is probably the one that you're most familiar with. In the medical model of disability, what's focused on is the individual and their particular impairment or pathology. In the medical model of disability, you're trying to help the person to overcome this challenge so that they can integrate into society and flourish. The medical model of disability then would focus on different kinds of medical interventions and therapies and rehabilitation so that the individual can change and fit into society in a way where they aren't limited or stigmatized by their disability. The social model is the other end of that spectrum. The social model can say so baldly that disability has nothing to do with impairment. Disability has nothing to do with your body or mind. Disability is completely related to how society is structured. This is the British strong social model against which Tom Shakespeare was pushing because of his experiences. In the United States, we developed a minority model of disability. Our disability rights movement fit right in with Black rights movements, with LGBTQ rights movements, with women's rights movements in the 60s. And it was bringing together a group that had something of a shared experience. Even though deafness, blindness, mobility challenges are so different in their experience, one thing they all shared was a shared experience of oppression and discrimination. In fact, if you think about this minority group of disability, you could enter it at any time. You can enter it through birth, you can enter it through accident, you can enter it through a traumatic situation. It's the only open minority group that we have. And guess what? You are going to enter it, and people in your churches have entered it. And that's another model, and these models are helpful, but Tom Shakespeare said it's more complex than that. Yes, the medical model talks about impairments, and sometimes it's really helpful to get the right medications and treatments that you need in order to live a fulfilling life. My friend Craig, he has cerebral palsy, and it caused spasticity. And when he was very young, he had what's called a dorsal rhizotomy that helped to stop his spasticity so that he'd have more control over his body movements. So that's where the medical model can be helpful for someone like Craig. But most of the discrimination my friend Craig faces, most of the opportunities that are taken from him aren't because of his impairment, it's because of how he's perceived. And that's the social model of disability. But Tom Shakespeare says, wait a second, I have these challenges related to my particular embodiment. I'm a wheelchair user. It makes it hard to navigate some things in the world, but I also have neuropathy, pain that doesn't make any sense. Why do I have this pain in my legs when they aren't even moving? And it makes it difficult to sleep. And even if there are laws that make sure I can have a 40-hour-a-week job to make the money I need to survive, I couldn't take it because I simply can't work 40 hours a week because I get tired. So those are impairment effects. And he says things like the beach. It's not the social setup of the beach. It's not people being mean. It's just that the beach is hard for me to navigate. You know, a mountain isn't holding attitudes towards me that are discriminatory. I just can't climb a mountain. And so it's more complex than that. But what many of us in the church have sort of inherited or inherited and embodied is some problematic biblical and theological models. Now, my colleague Carlos is going to tease these out a little bit more for you. But many of them are connected to ideas of healing, that it's related to sin, and the disability is viewed in wholly negative terms. And even in the theological seminary, we find out that it ends up in the theological curriculum somewhere that makes a statement about how we think about disability. For example, in pastoral care, we care for people with disabilities. It doesn't imagine that people with disabilities could care for others. Or it makes it into the question of theodicy. Theodicy is this justification of God in the face of challenges and evil. And if that's where disability makes it into the theological curriculum, what does that say to you if you have a disability? So the way that we experience people with disabilities is through labels and badges. On the one hand, a disability can be a label that could be positive, as I mentioned, because all supports and resources are label-led. I say I have a disability, and therefore I can get these services to support me. So a label can be good, but more often a label is negative. It's a way to marginalize somebody. It's a way to say, I know everything about this person. They are autistic, and autistic means this. So a label is something that we use to separate, differentiate ourselves from others and others from each other. Many people in the disability community got tired of other people deciding that they are disabled. Their slogan for the disability rights movement was nothing about us without us. If you're going to talk about disability, make sure we're at the table in the conversation. If something's going to be said, it needs to be in our own voices, even if those voices involve augmented speech. And so therefore, they chose the badge of disability as an honorable thing. And they said, you call me crippled, well, I am a crip. And I have crip culture and crip art and crip dance. And it's a celebration of who I am. And I bring unique things into this artistic world, into this theological conversation. In our churches, we need to learn how to use better language around disability. There's person-first language, so if we're talking about someone on the autism spectrum, we might say a person with autism. And we might think that we're doing a good thing. We're saying, I'm identifying you as a person and not by a label. But a person on the autism spectrum might say, wait a second, I embrace autism. I am an autistic person, and as Temple Grandin said, I have certain disabilities that give me other abilities. And then how about deafness? Something like deafness. So there's capital D deaf, that's a whole culture. A deaf person is different from hearing loss. Hearing loss suggests you had the ability to hear and then you lost it. Whereas a deaf person grew up deaf, is part of a culture of deafness, and it determines how they communicate. So sign language isn't a translation of spoken language or written language, it's its own language. And it has its own depth and excitement to it. It has its own way, an embodied way of communicating. So much so that when I was writing a chapter on deaf theology, I had 5 people not writing with me, but conversation partners. And I asked one of them, what do you think will happen in heaven? Do you think you'll be able to hear? And this deaf partner communicated to me, I don't know if I'll be able to hear, but I'm sure you'll be deaf. By that, he didn't mean I wouldn't be able to hear. He meant I'd have access to his way of being in the world that picks up things I can't possibly pick up because I'm so reliant on my hearing. Same thing with wheelchairs. You might remember earlier I introduced Tom Shakespeare as a wheelchair user. A wheelchair is something that he uses to move from place to place. It's a positive thing in his view. He's not wheelchair bound. That's a real negative. When I go from where I am right now in Holland, Michigan to Grand Rapids, I'm not car bound. A car is a tool I use to get from here to there. So I would say when we're talking to people with disabilities, you're not going to figure it out because everybody's different. Whether they were born with a disability, they might view it one way. If the disability was onset due to accident or illness, they might view it a different way. So I would defer to people with disabilities on how to identify or talk about the disability, but my biggest suggestion is to say, call them by their name. And then I would avoid terms like differently abled or special needs or handicapped or even worse, handy-capable. These are these kinds of words that are intended to say something positive, but to the disability community just come off as paternalistic. Make sure that when you're talking about disability, you do expect the gifts and acknowledge the gifts that come with the unique perspective of having a disability, but also acknowledge the challenges. And you can't say we're all disabled. There's a sense in which we are all disabled, but we don't all face discrimination because of it. So disability then for us in the church can become a lens for understanding what it means to be human. It can become a lens for understanding what it means to be an embodied disciple. So it can lead to hermeneutical insights. That means interpretive insights. When you read the Bible, you read it through the lens of your own experience. But a disability experience is different and will help you read and emphasize different parts of the Bible. Disability provides embodied experiential insights. And the reason it does this, in my understanding, years of doing this, is because people with disabilities are what I'd like to call, borrowing some language from a disability scholar named Rosemarie Garland Thompson, I would say people with disabilities are expert life hackers. That means they've learned to navigate a world that's not designed for them. This gives them a unique perspective on relationships, the world, how to move through space, how they're perceived, how people face marginalization. Disability, it turns out, is unexceptional. It's just part of the range of human experiences. You're all going to be in it. You all probably are in it for some point. It's a difference that society tends to devalue, but that can't be the case in our churches. Look at where Jesus went, the spaces he went, the homes he went into, the way he went out of his way to go to marginalized people. That demonstrates value. So for the church, it's not just a matter of following guidelines set by the Americans with Disability Act. It's a matter of justice, and it's a matter of the fullness of the church. And that's what disability is calling us to.